Careful now, wouldn't want you to drop those.
If you can dance this waltz the way it was written, I'll marry you tonight. In front of every single person in this room. Conrad Whitfield's voice carried clean across the ballroom floor, dropping over 300 guests like a glass drop deliberately onto marble, meant to shatter loud enough that everyone would turn and look. For 1 full second nobody breathed. Then someone near the orchestra laughed, a single bright, startled sound, and the laughter spread outward from there, the way fire spread through dry grass, catching guest after guest, until the whole grand room rang with it. Marisol Vega stood very still at the edge of the dance floor, with a tray of empty glasses, balanced against one hip, her catering uniform pressed and plain among 300 gowns that had each cost more than she earned in a year. She did not look up. She had learned, across 6 years of working other people's grandest parties, that looking up only ever invited more attention than a person in her position could afford to receive. Did you not hear the offer? Conrad pressed, stepping closer, the easy, practiced cruelty of a man who had never once in his 32 years been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered to him. He was tall, golden-haired, dressed in a tuxedo cut to flatter a frame kept lean by polo and yacht weekends, and he held out one hand toward her with the particular mockery of someone offering a trick to an animal that couldn't possibly perform it. I'm told the catering staff occasionally dabble. Surely you can manage 3 measures of a simple waltz, if the offer's generous enough to interest you. It had started, as these evenings often started for her, with someone else's carelessness. A drunken guest had stumbled into her tray 15 minutes earlier, sending a full set of champagne flutes crashing across the gown of Felicity Ashworth Drummond. The woman, Conrad's mother, had spent the entire social season quietly maneuvering him toward. Felicity had shrieked loud enough to draw the whole room's attention, and Conrad, eager to entertain his own birthday crowd at someone else's expense, had seized on the moment with the particular delight of a man who'd never once had to consider what cruelty cost the person absorbing it. This violin belonged to my grandmother, he'd announced moments before, though it was the waltz step itself he now demanded, holding out one gloved hand toward her as though offering a queen's invitation to a stray dog he expected to flinch and run. I'm told the household maids occasionally have hidden talents. Prove me wrong about you, and I'll marry you this very night, in front of every witness in this room. The crowd loved it. They always loved it. The particular delicious cruelty of watching someone with nothing be offered everything on terms designed to humiliate rather than honor. Marisol felt the heat climb up her neck, not from the audience's laughter alone, though that burned plenty, but from something considerably older and deeper that she had spent 8 years, keeping carefully buried beneath aprons, and serving trays and a name nobody in rooms like this one ever troubled to learn. 8 years ago, in a different city entirely, under a different name printed on concert programs, instead of catering rosters, Marisol Vega had been something else completely. She had been 12 when her mother first put her in a pair of proper dance shoes, 11 when the studio's master instructor pulled her aside after a recital and told Marisol's mother, in a voice trembling with something close to disbelief, that the girl moved like music, had simply chosen to live inside her rather than be taught to her the way it was taught to everyone else. By 14, she had a name in 3 cities. By 16, a standing invitation to train at the National Ballet's Junior Conservatory, the kind of invitation girls from her neighborhood didn't receive, the kind her mother had wept over at the kitchen table, certain her daughter's whole future had just changed shape entirely. Her mother had worked 2 jobs that whole year to cover the conservatory's fees the scholarship didn't fully stretch to, sewing alterations late into the night after long shifts at a downtown laundry, and never once complained of the cost, not once, not even on the worst nights when her hands ached too badly to hold a needle properly. She would sit in the studio's back row at every rehearsal she could manage to attend, beaming, with a pride so plain it embarrassed Marisol at 16, in the particular way only a mother's open love can embarrass a teenager who hasn't yet learned how rare and finite that kind of devotion actually is. It had changed shape, not the way anyone hoped. The accident happened on a wet October evening, her mother driving her home from a late rehearsal, headlights catching the rain at exactly the wrong angle, on exactly the wrong curve. Marisol remembered very little of the crash itself, only the sound, and her mother's voice cut off mid-sentence. She had been humming, softly, the same waltz Marisol had been rehearsing that evening, the two of them sharing the small, ordinary joy of a tune neither of them had tired of yet, and waking 3 days later in a hospital bed with a broken collarbone, 2 fractured ribs, and a silence in the room that told her everything, before anyone managed to say it aloud. Her mother had not survived the night. Marisol had not danced again for 8 years. Not once. Not even alone in an empty room. Not even when the physical therapists cleared her body to do it again within the year. Because some part of her had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that October night, that dancing was the thing she'd been doing while her mother died driving her home from it. And she could not separate the joy of the movement from the weight of that particular guilt, no matter how many years she let pass. She had left the conservatory, left the name that had once glowed on programs, taken work wherever work would have her, eventually landing in catering, where nobody asked questions about a steady, quiet woman with careful hands and a past she never once mentioned. She had told herself, across 8 years, that the silence was a kind of mercy. Standing now at the edge of a stranger's ballroom with 300 people laughing at her, this old grief and the new humiliation rose up together, so sharply she nearly dropped the tray in her hands. Well, Conrad pressed again, louder now, playing to the crowd rather than to her. Surely a maid, who's so quick to apologize for spilled champagne, has nothing to fear from a simple dance. Marisol set the tray down, slowly, deliberately. The whole room's laughter faltered, just slightly, at the sound of glass meeting marble, with more care than the moment seemed to call for. "I'll dance your waltz," she said, her voice carrying further than she expected it to. "But you'll hold to your word in front of every witness here, the same as you've demanded I hold to mine." The orchestra, uncertain, looked to their conductor, who looked to Conrad, who waved one careless hand toward the small ensemble, with the particular delight of a man who fully expected the evening's entertainment to end in humiliation rather than music. The opening measures began, slow and formal, the kind of waltz danced at conservatories and recitals rather than nightclub floors. Marisol closed her eyes for exactly one breath, then she stepped onto the floor. What followed was not, by any measure, a maid's clumsy attempt at 3 borrowed steps. It was 8 years of buried training finding its way back into a body that had never actually forgotten how to hold it. The precise, devastating grace of someone who had once been told, by people who knew, that she moved like music had simply chosen to live inside her. The laughter died first, then the murmuring, then, gradually, the whole room fell into the particular hush reserved for something nobody in for attendance had expected to witness in their lifetime. 300 guests, watching a catering maid turn Conrad Whitfield's cruel joke into the most extraordinary thing any of them had seen at a society party in years. Conrad did not look pleased. He looked, increasingly, like a man watching the ground shift beneath terms he'd never once expected to be called to honor. Marisol finished the final measure exactly as the music ended, perfectly on the beat, perfectly still, breathing hard in the sudden, ringing silence that followed. She did not look at Conrad. She looked, instead, at nothing in particular, somewhere past the crowd, somewhere her mother might have been watching from if such things were possible, and felt something break open in her chest that 8 years of careful silence had never once managed to heal on its own. A single, sharp sob escaped her before she could stop it. She did not try very hard to stop the second one. Conrad found her 20 minutes later, sitting alone on the terrace steps, her catering apron discarded somewhere inside, her face still wet, her whole bearing changed from the careful invisibility she'd worn all evening into something raw and unguarded that had clearly cost her 8 years to keep hidden this thoroughly. "I owe you considerably more than an apology," he said, sitting down a careful distance away, none of the performing cruelty left in his voice now. "I asked that question to humiliate you in front of my own birthday guests. I never once imagined I might actually be asking something that would cost you this much to answer. You couldn't have known." "No, but I should have considered, before I made a joke of someone's evident dignity, that there might be a story underneath it I had no right to demand answers to." He studied her a long moment. "Who taught you to dance like that?" She told him then, the whole of it, the conservatory and the accident, and the 8 years of silence that had followed, the words coming slow and halting at first, and then faster, as though the telling itself had been waiting 8 years for someone to finally ask the right question. "My mother used to say dance was the one language that never lied to you," Marisol said finally, wiping at her face with the back of one hand. "I haven't trusted myself to speak it since the night she died driving me home from learning it better." Conrad sat with that a long moment, the party's distant music still drifting faint through the open terrace doors. "I made a fool's wager tonight to entertain people who'd was once spent. I find I'm rather spend whatever influence I actually have, undoing the damage of that wager properly, if you'll let me, rather than simply walking away from it, once the laughters stopped being convenient. What would that even look like? I don't entirely know yet, but I'd like to find out, if you're willing to let me try." He did try, in the months that followed, with a persistence that surprised them both. He found her old conservatory instructor, now retired but still teaching privately, and quietly arranged, without ever making a show of it, for Marisol to begin lessons again, slow and careful, exactly as fast as she could bear, and not a step faster. He came to watch some of those early sessions himself, standing quietly at the back of the studio, saying nothing, simply present, the way a person learns to be present for someone relearning how to trust their own body with grief. With grief they'd spent years outrunning, instead of facing. The early sessions were harder than either of them expected. There were afternoons Marisol left the studio in tears before the lesson had properly begun, the music alone enough to summon the sound of breaking glass and her mother's voice cut off mid-sentence, and Conrad learned, slowly, exactly when to stay and when to simply drive her home in silence, and let the day end without forcing anything further from it. "You don't have to keep coming," she told him one such afternoon, sitting on the studio steps with her dance shoes still in her lap, untouched. "Watching me fall apart twice a week isn't anyone's idea of a pleasant way to spend an afternoon. I'm not here for pleasant, Marisol. I'm here because I made a joke of something I had no right to make light of, and I find the only way I know to properly atone for that is to keep showing up, even on the days it isn't easy to watch." He sat down beside her, the same careful distance he'd kept that first night on the terrace. "Your mother sounds like she'd have wanted you dancing again eventually, whatever it cost to get there." "You didn't know my mother." "No, but you watched you talk about her enough months now, to know she sounds like the kind of woman who'd rather see her daughter break open properly, and heal, than spend another 8 years carrying the silence instead." Marisol said nothing to that for a long while, turning the dance shoes over in her hands, before finally, slowly, lacing them back on, and returning to the studio floor. There was a particular afternoon, perhaps 4 months into the lessons, when her instructor finally played the waltz itself again, the same piece Conrad's cruel wager had forced out of her that first humiliating night, And Marisol stopped halfway through the second measure, her whole body gone rigid, her breath coming too fast. "I can't," she said, backing away from the center of the floor. "Not that one. Not yet. Then we won't," her instructor said simply, already reaching to change the music, no judgment in it at all. But Conrad, watching from the back of the room, understood something in that moment. Neither woman had quite said aloud that the waltz itself wasn't the obstacle. It was the version of it that lived only in the worst night of her life, the version that had broken her open in front of 300 strangers, rather than in the safety of a quiet studio, with people who actually cared what it cost her to dance it. He said nothing that day, but he began, quietly, researching the piece's history, learning it had been written, decades before, as a piece about grief transformed, rather than grief simply endured, and brought the discovery to her instructor, rather than to Marisol directly, trusting the teacher to find the right moment to use it. It was nearly a year before Marisol danced in public again, properly, on a real stage rather than a borrowed ballroom floor, a small showcase recital her old instructor arranged for students returning to the discipline after long absences. Conrad sat in the front row, exactly as he'd promised he would, and watched her move through a first steps, built around the very waltz that had broken her open on his terrace steps 11 months before. Except this time, the breaking open happened in private, in rehearsal, long before she ever stepped onto the stage, so that what the audience witnessed that evening was not grief finally surfacing, but grief, at last, properly healed. Through all of it, he never once raised the matter of the wager itself, the marriage proposal, made in cruelty on the worst night of her adult life, conspicuously absent from anything he said, or asked of her in the months that followed. He understood, without needing to be told, that whatever was growing quietly between them deserved to grow on its own honest terms, built one patient afternoon at a time, rather than claimed on the terms of a joke, made to humiliate a stranger in front of 300 witnesses. She found him afterward in the wings, still in her recital dress, and did not need to say anything at all before he crossed the distance between them, and simply held her, the way he'd learned, across nearly a year of patient, careful presence, that she actually needed to be held. Their story, in the end, proved something neither of them had expected: a cruel birthday joke to ever teach either one of them. That true strength is found not in burying pain, but in finally facing it, that healing rarely arrives on its own schedule, and almost never through the door anyone expects it to use, and that sometimes the cruelest moment in a person's life turns out, against every reasonable expectation, to be the very thing that finally sets them free.